In the last lesson, we wrote our custom useFetch hook, but I want to take some time for us to deepen our understanding of why we wrote the useEffect portion of this hook the way that we did, as well as understanding when to use the useEffect hook most effectively based on our needs because of how we actually pass in the second argument. So some of you might remember from our useEffect lesson that whenever we wrote the useEffect hook before, we passed in an array of dependencies. And whatever the dependency we put inside of that array would let us conditionally fire our useEffect hook. So for example, inside of this useFetch hook example, if the only time I wanted our actual fetch data inside of our useEffect hook to be fired whenever the URL changed, the URL being the prop being passed into this hook, then I would write inside of this array that I pass as the second argument, the actual URL property, meaning that I only want to fire useEffect whenever the URL prop has changed. However, if instead I wanted it to fire every time the useFetch hook gets called, which includes whenever the user component or the post component that uses our custom hook re-renders, meaning that whenever React makes our post or our user component re-render for whatever reason, then I want to fire the hook. If I don't pass that second array, that's exactly what will happen. useEffect will get called whenever useFetch gets called, meaning that whenever this component remounts, useFetch is getting recalled every single time. And I want this because I don't know if the user object inside of this user component is always the most up-to-date piece of data regarding the user. Because for some reason, as we know with our Firebase live database, our user might change. So we want to make sure that we're always trying our best to fetch the latest data related to our user. That's actually what's really great about the useEffect hook, is that we have multiple ways to conditionally decide when we actually want to call it. We can only call it on initialization if we pass an empty array, meaning that we only want to fire this effect when any of the dependencies change inside of this array. But there's no dependencies in our array, so we really only fire the useEffect hook the very first time it ever gets instantiated. Alternatively, if we wanted to only update useEffect whenever useEffect got called, then we pass no array. So that useEffect will always get triggered regardless of whatever dependencies change, because we're saying, I don't care what dependencies there are. I just want you to always fire my useEffect hook whenever either the hook containing it, so our useFetch hook, gets called, or inside of a component where useEffect is being used directly, whenever that component re-renders, I also want to just make sure I fire my hook. So that's what's really good about useEffect. We can have all these different ways that we can use it, you just have to think about your use case. So in our use case, because we know that our data might not always be up to date, we just want to make sure that we are always firing that useEffect hook that we wrote inside of useFetch whenever this component re-renders, for whatever reason it is. If the user ID changes, or if even the parent that's using user, so our app component re-renders, it'll re-render the user, we're just going to fetch again. That way, we're always making sure that what we're getting is the most up-to-date version of our user, even if the string that we're fetching from doesn't change. So if we're fetching the same user, that's fine for us because we want to make sure that we always have live and up-to-date data. We don't only want to change it when the user ID changes. So that's why we didn't pass any array into the second argument of useEffect for this reason. So hopefully that clarifies any questions, but it also helps you understand when to use useEffect with an array of no dependencies, with an array of dependencies, and with no array at all. Okay, let's move on with our lesson.